Hello, I am Mónica Belevan, Chief Concept Officer at Accursed. I'm here to introduce our collaboration with Merlin Sheldrake, the author of Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Future, and the winner of this year's Royal Society Science Book Prize. Merlin is a biologist with a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a pre-doctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. He studies the relationships that form between plants and symbiotic fungi that live in their roots, known as mycorrhizal fungi. This collaboration is made possible by Wilmore Academy, a marketplace enabling artists and academics to launch NFTs in support of research. Good morning, Merlin. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Morning, Monica. It's great to be here.
Where are you right now?
I'm in England.
Lovely. So, over the past 5 or so years, fungi began to appear prominently in the zeitgeist, and your book hints strongly as to why that may be. In Entangled Life, you cite network scientist Albert Laszlo Barabasi saying it was not until the mid-90s that networks started to enter the public consciousness. Extremely recent history that has already changed culture, but that is also still finding new shapes. This extends to your theme, mycorrhizal networks, as network thinking came into the mainstream with such force that one can hardly imagine life before it, unless one is old enough to remember it. In many ways, the world before networks subsists only as memory, which is of course itself a form of information processing. As a man of both worlds, what drew you to the study of fungi and what keeps you there?
So many things. I think, like many people who study fungi, the more I find out about them, the more I want to know. And so I spiral deeper and deeper into fascination and wonder. But maybe to pick out a couple of themes that endure. One is just my astonishment at how much these organisms do and have done to create and support the biosphere within which we exist. And whether as decomposers, whether as symbiotic organisms that underlie many of the great world-making relationships, like land plants, for example, we might get into that later. The abilities that fungi have, the things that they can do, defy my animal imagination and just draw me in on a basic wonder and awe level. But besides that, I found that thinking about fungi makes me more aware of the shimmering networks of interrelationship and interconnection, which is the living world. It's very easy for us to think in our individualized cultures and lives as the world is being made out of discrete units of stuff. But in fact, this is a fallacy. And fungi remind us of this. Fungi form physical connections between different organisms. They are living networks. So they draw me in to a more interconnected and a holistic worldview, which I find good medicine for my human-centeredness. And perhaps finally, they're so strange and they trick me out of so many of my preconceptions about how the world works. They lure me into new possibilities. They decompose many of the tired categories that I organize my life with, that I've inherited from the culture that I have grown up within. And so I feel that thinking about fungi makes the world look different and can generate new ways of thinking. And I find that enormously stimulating.
I love that. They challenge all of our priors, and the book is really mind-boggling. And one of its great merits, I think, is how successfully and artfully it articulates a very difficult conversation around information and its transmission. While you explicitly acknowledge the limitations of analogies in your book, your literary sensibility is such that you also have to see it as continuous affordances for further networking. I like to play a little bit with this poetic license as we go further into our conversation. Entangled Life establishes that the study of fungi complicates notions of identity, autonomy, individuality, intelligence, all themes which speak to contemporary transformations in Web3. Recent developments in crypto, for example, have focused on questions around the nature of blockchain-based decentralization, especially through the rise of executive collectives known as DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which explore localized models of governance in service of specific objectives. So this is similar in some ways to how fungi navigate decisions concerning behavioral responses on everything from trade to trade-offs through decentralized decision-making. Can you tell us a bit more what this is and how it works with fungi?
Mm-hmm. So fungi are able to navigate their environments, make decisions between alternative courses of action, form enormously elaborate and complicated relationships, produce weather systems of chemical enzymes over here while doing something completely different over there, transport material around themselves, and constantly remodel themselves. And they're able to do all of this without a brain. They don't have a central place where they link perception and action. And as centralized organisms with brains and with hearts, and organisms who model many of our systems of governance, though not all, of course, on our brains, like with capital cities, heads of state. We see this language trickling into all sorts of conversations. This is confusing for us to understand how are fungi able to do this? How are they able to behave, live their lives bathed in rich fields of sensory information, and do things we can't do and without a brain? And so this is a decentralized way of life, a decentralized mode of existence. And a good example of the fungal behaviors that challenge our animal imaginations. So when thinking about how fungi are able to solve problems and do the things they do, this idea of decentralization is a big one that we'll keep bumping up against. So it's interesting to see these decentralized organizational structures emerge within some of these newer technologies like blockchain, as you say. Although I think there is quite a long history of humans attempting to throw off rigid vertical control structures and hierarchies and replace them with more egalitarian models, participatory models. I think of the Protestant nonconformists in the 17th century, the diggers and the ranters and the levelers, the Quakers, throwing off old, very rigid and hierarchical models and exploring new forms of governance, new forms of collective decision-making and possibility, organized around their objectives, spiritual and political objectives. So it's interesting to see these behaviors repeat themselves in different manners and modes, depending on the technologies of the day.
It really is. It's fascinating. We seem to have both pulsions within ourselves to hierarchize and to de-hierarchize at the same time. And it's like this cycling thing. So this is just, a latest iteration in something that is, a sort of repeating motif in recorded history. It's really fascinating. If only we were as consistent as mushrooms, which we're not. So one of the things that makes our collaboration so interesting to me is how it could be read as a manner of appendix to your book, a continuation, an extension pack on fungi for Web3. In reading it, it came to my attention that the identification of fungi as a separate natural kingdom coincides in time with the earliest inception of the internet and the first flush of cybernetics. It all happens more or less at the same time. And all of these are spheres which have moved towards a greater interpretive convergence in decades since. Each can extend and expand on the imagination and the language of the other. In this context, the blockchain, as the latest chapter in the evolution of the internet, I suppose, is perhaps as interesting a development to mycologists as fungi should be to anyone in Web3. I can tell you that on our end, Entangled Life has already been added to Accursed's library because it provides such an exciting heuristic through which to explain our corner of the world to the curious within and without it. And I would be curious to know what happens conversely. When did you first hear of the blockchain and what clicked when you did, if anything? And in developing your first Web3 project with us, what have you discovered or confirmed or about your intuitions of the space?
I can't remember when I first heard the word blockchain, but I don't think anything clicked when it happened, and I don't think anything has clicked since, if I'm honest.
It is.
But I think the main thing that strikes me about this space is the astonishing flux that is underway, and the great number of open questions that are underway, and also the confusion and the disruptive potential, and the fact that that potential is potential rather than something that has been fully realized yet. And so I'm intrigued to see where it will go. But it feels like a big stirring, a big flux, and with a lot of hype and a lot of careful thinking as well.
It is, as a latecomer myself, I see it as an enormous possibility space. And I think that is what makes it most tantalizing, is that it's really opening up a series of conversations that cannot be had in the frames as we had them. And so that kind of expansion is very, very rich. And let's see. Tell me a little bit about how this might connect, for example, to collective memory, and the blockchain as a ledger may be enabling that or facilitating it for humans. What do you think of that?
I think a lot about, I think a lot in processual terms. So in terms of the universe is made up of processes, and I have learned these ways of thinking from a number of eminent processual thinkers, most notably Alfred North Whitehead, but Heraclitus was perhaps a originator of this process thought, although it's an intuition that you can find in many wisdom and spiritual traditions around the world. And the idea being that the universe is made up of processes, not made up of things. And everything starts to change when you see the world as made up of processes rather than things. For example, our bodies, which we think of as enduring stuff, become really patterns of stability through which stuff is passing. The material that makes up your body is different material. The molecules and atoms are different from those that made up your body several years ago. And so with this in mind, I think a lot about the ways that organisms map their own history in their bodies. Trees and fungi are both examples of organisms that grow from growing tips and leave behind them in the form of trunks and branches a sort of cartographical representation of their history, the place that they have been in the branching and the twisting and the fusing of their bodies. And so you can see the flow of time embodied in the present moment. And perhaps the blockchain is a little like this, in the sense that the chain of blocks represents a flow of time, the inscriptions of what was happening in different moments in time, and that this is similarly some kind of a record of the passage of time, which is inscribed and maintained in the present moment. I think maybe one of the differences between the plants and the fungi is that plants and fungi tend to branch and branch and branch, whereas blockchains only really work if you can achieve consensus somehow. Of course, there can be hard forks, but those are somewhat less frequent occurrences. So they may be moving in opposite directions, plants and fungi more towards divergence, and blockchains more towards convergence and consensus. But still, that's one point of overlap that I've thought of in relation to processual views of the world, and the ways that we inscribe the passage of time and the continual state of becoming.
Yes, I think that the blockchain gives us a new sense of what a permanent record can be, and in a way, the idea is that it should also entail a sort of accountability. But yes, these are the notches in the notches in the blockchain, which are all traceable back, and so you have a complete archive of all the operations transacted on it, which is completely fascinating. In relation to this that you're mentioning, the processual, well, you've told us that fungi predate vertebrates. They certainly predate us humans. They have served as training wheels for plant life to take hold on land. They are integral to metabolizing all life on Earth and to its future. As with geology, I suppose fungi have and are on their own time scale, one that may have proven almost unimaginable to us until quite recently. So this made me think of Nick Land's 2016 remark on the blockchain as artificial absolute time for the first time ever in human history, which results in a scrambling of our sense of pre and post. As a mycologist, you have been operating in a similar time space for the entirety of your career. Mycelium is, if anything, the original blockchain, and there's a sense in which you have been in this space before any of us. What can you tell us about how mycelial timescapes behave? And on a completely speculative plane, how could they conceivably develop as they have been doing since, eonic time?
Hmm. Well, I think one of the ways that they're timescapes, as I said, as portraits of time, as representing in a cartographical way their recent history, as mapped in space, time mapped in space in the form of the trails and entanglements left by multiple growing tips as they grow outwards. But in the terms of deep time, they're very old indeed. Over 1 billion years of fungal evolution has shaped life on Earth, and but one of the fascinating things about them is that when we find fossil fungi, they look very much like fungi do today. And when we find fossil animals, you see a whole crazy bestiaries of forms. And so animal evolution is characterized by great flux and a variety of forms. But although there are very many ways to be a fungus, you can have mycelial networks that sprawl across kilometers, and you can have mycelial networks that are small enough to fit on a speck of house dust. The basic network lifestyle has remained remarkably consistent. And so there's something, it's almost like they've solved a fundamental problem already. And although they continue to evolve and respond to new challenges, there's something that's clicked quite some time ago. So when thinking speculatively about future fungal timescapes, I can imagine them doing rather like the things they've done in the past, forming networks and through their flexibility and collaborative nature, enter into all sorts of new relationships and encounters, and opportunistically make something of them, tangling life's stories together, tangling different kingdoms of life together, and creating a fertile compost for the future becoming of life on Earth.
I love this. Tell me about your unique scanning process and what it is these scans show, as it is truly very few among the uninitiated who will have seen anything like them before. You guided our brand director, Felipe Medeiros, as he worked off hundreds of your proprietary scans to arrive at an aesthetic for this project. The results are as dazzling as they are surprising. What was this process like for you? And what do you think of the connections between art and science, which are very palpable in your book?
So first of all, the scans are made using what's called a confocal laser scanning microscope. And first of all, the roots you clear them using chemicals so that they are permeable to light, and then stain using fluorescent dyes, the plant material and the fungal material. But you stain them using different fluorescent dyes. And then you embed them in resin. And when you put them under this confocal laser scanning microscope, you shine different lasers. One laser excites the fungal material, or the fluorescent dye in the fungal material, and one laser excites the fluorescent dye in the plant material and collects those data streams on different channels. And so what you end up with is a rendition of the fungus and a rendition of the plant material. And when you scan slice after slice down through the sample, you end up with a stack of those images, which you can then render into three-dimensional scans, which is what these pieces are made from. So it's a way to look inside roots and to see the way that these different organisms are relating in physical space, and revealing the astonishing intimacy of this relationship. These plants are some kind of an organ, prosthetic organ of the fungus, and likewise the fungus is a kind of prosthetic organ of the plant. Neither could live without the other, and plants could not have evolved without these fungal companions. And this is a way to see and to feel, I find, that intimacy, this world-changing intimacy. So when it comes to science and arts, yes, I've always found it frustrating that these things should be seen as entirely different departments of human life. Both of what we call science and what we call the arts arise from human faculties of imagination, wonder, and curiosity, both about the phenomena unfolding around us and with our abilities to meaningfully experience those phenomena. And so this division, it feels artificial. I think it's a bifurcation that's thrown up all sorts of boundaries that we stumble over, mistaking them for natural features of our minds. This goes right back to a centuries-old bifurcation between the world into primary quantities and secondary qualities, something that we find in Galileo. But scientists are and have always been intuitive, whole, creative, emotional human beings trying to make sense of a world that was never meant to be catalogued and systematized, and have to communicate their insights in imaginative language composed of analogy and metaphor. And so, yeah, I find to find the places where borders become porous or wear thin, and the whole pantomime absurdity of this division-making habit that we have becomes clear, and find the fun in those moments, and laugh, and also busily get on with inquiring with all my faculties. It feels as a whole human being, rather than dividing my mind up into departments. It's more fun that way.
I think so too. And fungi are a litmus test to that. They really push that edge. You were talking about intimacy, and it's a very important theme in your book and in your entire overriding thesis, I think. One of the greater graces of Entangled Life is how it weaves in human experience, family life, the anecdotal into what might otherwise be very technical and sublime research. Among the big subjacent themes of your book is intimacy at sometimes really unusual scales and removes. It is integral to your definition of symbiosis, for example, but you also share a great deal of your life and other lives with us, hence the entanglements. In doing so, you anchor the impenetrable and the inscrutable in the sense-making activity of human interaction to produce an epic of diplomacy and exchange, collaboration and competition amongst individuals, but also between natural kingdoms. I strongly feel that being able to do something analogous, build affect, is essential for creators in Web3 and truly indispensable to the space's broader success. As you may know, the Web3 promise of trustlessness is also frictionless. And I think that a danger in our space is that it isn't slippery when wet, or at least not yet. I think a lot about Wittgenstein writing in the Philosophical Investigations that we have got onto slippery ice where there is no friction. And so in a certain way, the conditions are ideal just because of that. We weren't able to walk. And so we want to walk and we need friction, back to the rough ground. Entangled Life doesn't just teach us about networks, mycelial and otherwise, it provides us with enough of this rough ground to explore them in digestible, expressive, and inventive ways that will inform our own project design and discourse going forward. So this may seem like a bit of an odd question, Merlin, but how does one, as a human individual, write and hence think about such complex networks? What is your experience of sense making at the edge of such an intimate and at the same time alien world?
Well, I think one of the traps that I fall into myself, and I've seen problems arising from this in the world at large, when we think about networks as connections between separate entities. And so we think about these entities as separate and thus are connected after they're already separate. So somehow a link in a network can speak to our reductive tendency as much as it speaks to a holistic tendency or an interconnected tendency. Within the living world, you find, and indeed in our lives with friendships and family members and our relationships with even more than human organisms, plants or pets or whoever, that the relationship shapes the identity of those doing the relating, that the relationship is as important as the entities doing the relating. And so this kind of co-creative interaction is something that you see all the time in evolution. You see it in lichens are a good example, of plants and fungi are a good example. There are many, many other examples of the relationship, and thus the networks of relationship being these places where relating is almost primary to those creatures doing the relating. And so on this ground, I see networks in the living world as about connection. And so when I'm trying to think about complex networks, I think about connection. I think about the ways that I feel connection and I imagine connection and relate to that on a deep, intuitive, felt level, as well as on an intellectual level. So there are many ways that I've tried to think these things through. But music's been very helpful for me. I find, for example, when thinking about fungal networks, this relationship of different fungal cells which branch and fuse and grow from countless tips as they explore and remodel themselves. I think of polyphonic music, and I found this a very helpful way to feel and imagine the complexity of these networks. Polyphonic music is music made up of more than one voice. More than one part is voiced at once, and without ceasing to be many, these voices intertwine and in and around one another. And if you listen, you can hear these separate voices intertwining, but if you listen in a slightly different way, you can hear them all come together to make the piece of music that you're hearing. And so I've used this as a sort of a metaphor to feel my way into organic network formation, and in a kind of metaphorical way, just to put me in a mind and a body of this connective aspect of network formation rather than the disconnective aspect of network formation, which I feel is very important.
That's just marvelous. I think the fundamental affinity between what you have been exploring and what we are doing is that it really does stem from a relational ethos. That's what drives it. That's its sort of founding force. And so there's an immense complementarity in that sense about, shared objectives is to kind of like foment that type of thinking, which in turn results in, certain tweaks to the way in which you live and the way in which you relate to others. In that sense, it has really been transfixing to read your book and feel a lot of this kind of, this resonance that this does exist not only in small human collectives, but, in the fundamental undergirding of nature. There's something very, very powerful there. And I wanted to thank you, Merlin, for sitting down to have this interview with me. And I hope that we will continue this conversation and that we can teach you more about Web3 and you can teach us more about fungi, because I really think that there's something potentially polyphonic happening there, and we might do well to explore it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Merlin. It's been a huge, huge pleasure. Oh, by the way, do you have the book that you might want to show us? And if you could tell us a little bit about what this beautiful object is.
Well, when I published my book, I fed 2 copies to oyster mushroom fungi, which grew through the book and rotted the pages and then sprouted mushrooms out of the book. And I then picked the mushrooms and ate them as a way to eat my words and as a way to fold myself back into the metabolic cycles that I've been describing all this time, but have become somewhat detached from sitting in front of a computer screen. So this is the rotted book. You can see the bits where I picked the mushrooms, but now it's dried into this mycelial mass, and sits here on the mantelpiece. And
it's gorgeous.
Yeah,
it's gorgeous. How long did it take for the oyster mushrooms to take over the situation?
They take about 3 weeks to grow through the
That's
book,
fast.
and then it's about
Yeah.
5 days to fruit. So they can work through quite a lot of books in a short
Amazing.
amount of time.
Thank you so much, Merlin. Let's be talking soon.
Well, thank you, Monica.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.